Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Woodcock, and I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Welcome back to Novara Live. How you doing?
I've had quite an interesting day today. So I'm off to Italy tomorrow, but every single possible thing that could possibly have made my day frustrating when getting prepared, all of that stuff's happened. So I'm just glad to be able to actually get down to something that's not stressing myself out with the stuff that is involved with when you go away.
Maybe I'm going to do a Piers Morgan on you and sort of interrupt every time you try and answer a question. It's going to be even worse than packing. I will try not to do that, don't worry. Also, I should say thank you to Stephen Methven for his debut hosting yesterday. I was away in Dublin with my partner, and I was sort of in the airport looking at the news. I was like, Jesus, this is a difficult day to do your first day of hosting. You had the ICC announcing it was a requested arrest warrant on Netanyahu. The Iranian president died. You got the blood scandal. I mean, it was the biggest news day of the year. I was almost disappointed not to be here, but you were in safe hands. Coming up later tonight, we'll be talking to the man taking on Keir Starmer in his own constituency. An Israel lobbyist, Lord, has released a report calling to restrict the right to protest. We won't be speaking to him, but we will be speaking about him. And we will also be talking to Professor Francis A Boyle shortly about the ICC arrest warrant request for Benjamin Netanyahu and Biden's response to that. So some heavyweight guests this evening. International law is supposed to be universal, but within hours of the ICC chief prosecutor announcing his request for an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, Joe Biden made clear that he didn't see it like that.
We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. And it's clear Israel wants to do all it can to ensure civilian protection. But let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide. We reject that.
Very macabre, isn't it? We don't think that the ICC prosecuting this war criminal is a good idea. Woo! Whoop! Slay! Joe Biden! Yes! It's sort of it's very out of step. I mean, very similar actually to, when you had these sort of protests talking about genocide in Palestine, everyone just started shouting 4 more years, but that seemed even more on the nose. That was, of course, Joe Biden saying he rejected the request for an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court to Netanyahu and Gallant. For good measure, he also reaffirmed his rejection of the charges of genocide leveled against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Of course, these two institutions, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Now, in an example of hypocrisy that has now become painfully familiar, this is the complete opposite of how Biden responded last year when the ICC charged Vladimir Putin with war crimes. So then he welcomed it. Now he says this is completely outrageous. So how has the White House justified their different approach in the cases of Russia and Israel? Well, it all comes down to the question of jurisdiction. In the case of Putin's arrest warrant, the US argued that while Russia wasn't a member of the ICC, Ukraine was, and therefore war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine were within the jurisdiction of the court. The ICC argues the same situation applies in the case of Netanyahu's warrant, or the request for Netanyahu's warrant. Its prosecutor argues that while Israel, like Russia, is not a member state of the ICC, Palestine, like Ukraine, is. And therefore the court, just as in the Ukraine war, has jurisdiction over war crimes committed in Gaza. Now that sounds very sensible, it sounds very intuitive, but the Americans disagree. This was State Department spokesperson Matt Miller speaking yesterday.
We believe that there should be the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, and an independent Palestinian state would have the ability to join the Rome Statute and become a member of the International Criminal Court, as every state in the world has the right to do. But that is not
So where do they go in the meantime?
They are not SOL. I said, first of all, Israel has its own investigations. Second, we have accountability mechanisms here. We have processes that are ongoing to look at Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law. So there are places to look at these questions. It's just, in our view, fundamentally not a role of the ICC.
So according to the United States, Palestine is not a state, and so can't be a member of the ICC. And therefore, if Palestinians want justice, they have to go via the courts of their occupiers, right? Them's the breaks. Oh, we want it to be a state too, but it's not a state, and that means it's just got to go to the courts in Israel. Well, one of the reasons it's not a state is because the United States are backing to the hilt the politician who has sort of made it his lifelong ambition to deny the Palestinians a state. So this idea, we want a state too. It's a position which is completely morally abject. It's also legally dubious. Now, that's because the Palestinians aren't just claiming willy-nilly to be a member state of the ICC. They applied to be a member a decade ago, and a decade ago, they were accepted, right? So to say that Palestine's admission was invalid, they're not a real state, they can't be a real member, that's to reject the independence and authority of the judges on the ICC. Now, this isn't anything new, of course. The United States has never been a member of the ICC, so they say other people should be subject to it. We won't be, though. And just 2 weeks ago, 12 Republican senators wrote to ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, threatening sanctions if he issued arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Ominously, they said, target Israel and we will target you. Yesterday, Khan was asked about those threats.
There's hotheads everywhere, and there's people that are mature statesmen and stateswomen and leaders. There are those that have fidelity to something greater than themselves, whether it's their constitutions, but ultimately it's the rule of law. The good news is, I think, for the last 2.5 years, we've had very positive engagement with the Biden administration in the United States. We're working across a range of situations, whether it's in Ukraine or Darfur. And I've said to distinguished members on the Hill and to the administration that Rome Statute values are quintessential American values. It's against bullying. It's against the untrammeled power against the most vulnerable. It's the rights and the dignity of the individual. It's the protection of babies. I mean, these are fundamental American values that should engender bipartisan support. Now, of course, this situation, unfortunately, lies on the San Andreas fault of international politics and strategic interests. And of course, I've had some elected leaders speak to me and be very blunt. This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, was what one senior leader told me. We don't view it like that.
This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin. That was the message from a senior American politician to Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC. But has Karim Khan called America's bluff? I'm now joined by Francis A. Boyle, Professor of International Law at the University of Illinois College of Law. Professor Boyle has a long and distinguished career in international law, including representing Bosnia and Herzegovina in its genocide case against Slobodan Milosevic. He currently serves as a legal counsel to the Palestinian Authority. To begin, Francis, I understand you really have a role in what we're seeing this week, because you were someone who was advising Mahmoud Abbas to apply for membership of the ICC. Could you talk about that, your role in that, and whether you think this move this week has vindicated Palestine's decision to apply to be a member?
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for having me on, and my best to all my friends there in Britain. After Operation Cast Lead concluded in January 2009, exterminating about 1,500 Palestinians, I did advise Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for Palestine and the Palestinians, which he did do. Unfortunately, the ICC had not done anything to help and protect the Palestinians until last Monday. So better late than never. We now have well over 40,000 dead Palestinians, 80,000 wounded. Israel has now entered into Rafah. 900,000 Palestinians have now been ethnically cleansed out of Rafah. We could be seeing a genocidal humanitarian catastrophe in Rafah that is just as bad, if not worse, than the genocidal massacre at Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I was the attorney of record for the mothers of Srebrenica and Podrina, and convinced the prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a predecessor to the ICC, to indict Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic for almost every crime in the ICTY statute, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of genocide. One for genocide in general against Bosnia, and the second for genocide in particular at Srebrenica. As you know, he died on trial in The Hague, but the tribunal had dismissed his motion to dismiss all charges, ruling that the prosecution had produced sufficient evidence to convict him, but we never got a final verdict there.
We played the clip of Karim Khan sort of saying that an American elected politician, told him that the ICC was for Africans and thugs like Putin, or basically, enemies of the Western democracies. Now, it sounds like that politician was saying that, and he thought that was correct. That's how it should be. But there were sort of elements of that statement which reminded me of things that I've heard you say in the past, which is that, in essence, the ICC has acted like a body that only prosecutes African leaders and then people who are enemies of the West. I mean, could you talk about how momentous it is for the International Criminal Court to have opened a case or to have requested an arrest warrant for a leader of a key ally to the Western states and to the United States?
Well, you're right, Michael. In my book, World Politics, Human Rights, and International Law, I have a chapter entitled International Criminal Court, the White Man's Court, because up until quite recently, that's all they did. They went after these black tin pot dictators in Africa. By comparison, so far, they have not indicted one leader of the United States government, despite the fact that I filed a complaint with the ICC in 2010 against Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Ashcroft, Condoleezza Rice, and the rest of them for their policy of extraordinary rendition. Now, finally, the first prosecutor, Moreno Ocampo, did nothing on it. Finally, Madam Bensouda from Gambia did get permission to open that investigation. And then Karim Khan came in, and he just summarily dismissed this complaint. Not a good sign at all. Likewise, let's take Tony Blair. The British human rights lawyers filed a perfectly correct complaint with the ICC against Tony Blair for what he did in Iraq, Britain being a party to the Rome Statute. The British attorneys ran this by me for any input I had. It was an excellent complaint on the merits. It was just dismissed. The ICC has so far not indicted even one leader of a NATO state. For example, for all the death and destruction they inflicted in Libya. Maybe 50,000 Libyans were exterminated outright at the beginning of that war. And as of now, the last figure I read, maybe 500,000 are dead. Well, they went after Colonel Gaddafi, but all the European leaders and Obama escaped scot-free. So, yes, you are correct. Putin was the first white European they went after, and you'll know Karim Khan hopped to it between you and me. Lickety-split speed in getting all those papers together, filing them, and getting the arrest warrants issued. Whereas here, after October 8th, it takes at least 40,000 exterminated Palestinians, 80,000 wounded, and all of Gaza to be completely destroyed before he finally does something. Well, at least he did something. So thank heavens for that, Michael.
The move is belated. What's your sort of assessment of what might happen next, though? How significant do you think this could be in terms of Israel's ability to prosecute its genocidal war against the Palestinians? And I suppose particularly I'd be interested in knowing how this might affect America's capacity to feel that it can continue to give Israel essentially unconditional support.
Most of Israel's political, economic, military support comes from the United States, Canada, and European Union member states. And now Britain no longer a member of the EU. But all of those states I mentioned to you, except the United States, are parties to the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. So all these leaders in Canada, Britain, and in Europe are going to ask themselves, do I really want to be dealing with indicted war criminals like Netanyahu and Gallant? I don't know why Karim Khan did not indict the chief of staff, Halevi. He should have. They usually follow the military chain of command. He would have been third. But okay, the top leaders here have been indicted. And so I think, as Mr. Borelli pointed out there today, the European states are going to have to be taking this matter into consideration. I know your foreign minister, Cameron, said, well, we're still going to be providing weapons to Israel. Well, Britain is a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Do Prime Minister Sunak and Foreign Minister and your defense minister, I think his name is Lapps, do they want to be aiding and abetting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide here? And what is their personal culpability then under the Rome Statute for the International Court for doing this? So I think all the leaders in Europe, UK, Canada will be taking this matter into account. Here in the United States, you've seen the response by President Biden. Well, that's typical of the Zionist domination and control here of our political parties and political leaders. Until quite recently, only have we had some political leaders speak out.
It does seem like the opposition to this in the United States is very strong. How far could the White House go? And I suppose also, we're hearing from senators, aren't we? Sort of they were threatening sanctions against the ICC. Is that something that could we really see sort of America sanction the ICC over this case?
President Trump did impose sanctions as an executive order under Madam Bensouda and other judges and staff there at the ICC. But when Biden came in, he lifted those sanctions. As you know, legislation has been introduced in the Congress now to sanction them all over again. But that would have to be approved by both houses of Congress and signed into law by President Biden. It'd really be up to Biden to decide, well, is he really going to restore the sanctions imposed by Trump on the ICC? Is he going to follow in the footsteps of Trump? I doubt he will, but I really can't predict exactly what's going through his mind right now.
Just to clarify, this is, of course, still only a request from the chief prosecutor for an arrest warrant. The arrest warrant hasn't yet been given because that goes to a panel of judges. How certain are you that they will sort of accept this request, and what would the time frame be for that?
All I can speak is, Michael, here on the merits, because I'm sure enormous pressure is now being put on the panel of judges that will be considering the request for the warrants, certainly by the United States, by Israel, and by Zionists all over the world. Bribery, threaten, intimidation, blackmail, they will stop at nothing. But that being said, I have read the statement by the prosecutor, and then the same time he released the statement, he also released a memorandum of law in support of that statement that you can find on the webpage of the Financial Times. I read it there yesterday morning. It has on there some of the top jurists there in Britain, for the most part, not everyone. And there you have Ted Marone from the United States. I know Ted. Ted's a Holocaust survivor and had been legal advisor to the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So it's hard to say this is an anti-Semitic effort if you have Ted Marone on there. But you can read the memorandum, and they agree jurisdiction is there and the facts are there. They have reviewed the evidence. Of course, the evidence has not been yet publicly disclosed by the prosecutor. However, if you do read all the oral and written submissions, which I have, and listen to them in the cases of South Africa versus Israel for genocide against the Palestinians, and also in the case of Nicaragua versus Germany for aiding and abetting genocide against the Palestinians. It's a voluminous amount of evidence right there, all drawn from reputable sources, indeed, mostly from sources by the United Nations organizations, affiliated organizations, UN special rapporteurs, and things of that nature. And the reason why the lawyers in these two cases did it that way is that the International Court of Justice basically takes judicial notice of findings of fact by United Nations affiliated sources. They did the same thing for me when I won those two world court orders for Bosnia against Yugoslavia. I was very careful to put in all the information I possibly could generated by United Nations sources and then supplemented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and a handful of other reputable human rights organizations. So you could read all the submissions and watch the oral arguments by South Africa and Nicaragua, and you'll see the evidence is overwhelming, not just for crimes against humanity and war crimes, but in my opinion, genocide as well.
Is there any chance, is there sort of any possible world in which Netanyahu actually stands trial in The Hague?
Well, Michael, I did personally go after Slobodan Milosevic in the International Court of Justice in March and April of 1993 and accused him of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity against the Bosnians. And then in 2000, I convinced the prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a predecessor to the International Criminal Court, to indict him for almost every crime in the ICTY statute, including 2 counts of genocide. And in 2004, he was turned over to the ICTY, and he was on trial before the ICTY on all these charges. He filed a motion to dismiss after the close of the prosecution's case. The tribunal considered it and rejected it and ruled that there was enough evidence produced by the prosecutor to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt on all charges, including the 2 counts of genocide, and instructed Milosevic to open his defense, whereupon he died. So we never got to his defense or a final conviction on the merit. But if I could do all that work against Milosevic myself, single-handedly bringing him to justice, I know there's an army of international lawyers out there all over the world who will try to bring Netanyahu, Gallant, President Herzog, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the rest of them to the bar of justice somewhere. Yes.
Professor Francis A. Boyle, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate your insights. Let's move on to more on this story. So ICC prosecutor Karim Khan's case against Israeli leaders hasn't gone down well with the United States. And if the US doesn't like it, then usually neither does the United Kingdom. This was Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the prospect of an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu.
This is a deeply unhelpful development. Of course, it's still subject to a final decision, but it remains deeply unhelpful nonetheless. There is no moral equivalence between a democratic state exercising its lawful right to self-defense and the terrorist group Hamas. And it's wrong to conflate and as I said, equivocate between those two different entities. And what I'm very clear is that this will make absolutely no difference in getting a pause in the fighting, getting aid into the region, or indeed the hostages out.
This is deeply unhelpful. This is what we really care about, is getting aid in, and that's why we're opposed to this ICC indictment. Just say it. Just be honest, right? Oh yeah, Israel are our allies, and so we're not that keen on this case. The idea that he is sort of standing there with moral integrity. I think that actually for the Palestinians, it would be better if this case didn't go forward. It's just no one believes that, do they? What about Labour? This may shock you. The party seems to have gone in a different direction to Joe Biden. Right? This is the first time, I think, since this war began. This was Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy in Parliament yesterday.
Labour's position is that the decision by the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor to apply for arrest warrants is an independent matter for the court and the prosecutor. Does the Minister agree? Labour believes that the International Criminal Court's independence must be upheld and respected, and that it is right that the conduct of all parties is addressed by the court. Does the Minister agree? Labour believes that the focus of politicians should be on achieving an immediate ceasefire to end the war in Gaza, free the hostages, alleviate the humanitarian crisis, and create a pathway towards a lasting political solution. Does the Minister agree? And Labour believes that the UK and all parties to the Rome Statute have a legal obligation to comply with orders and warrants issued by the court. Democracies who believe in the rule of law must submit themselves to it.
No, I have to say that was a significantly different position to what Rishi Sunak expressed, and it was a much better position than what Rishi Sunak expressed. Obviously, we've been incredibly critical of Labour's approach throughout this. I think it's probably a bit premature to say maybe they're now coming to a more reasonable position, but that there was a more reasonable position than what we've become used to. Labour's position is one that's reflected by many of our European neighbours. So France and Belgium have said they back the independence of the International Criminal Court. And even Germany says it respects the independence and processes of the ICC, though its foreign ministry has rejected any equivalence between Hamas's actions and Israel's. That, of course, was not what the ICC was doing anyway. They judge people's actions against international law, not against whoever they're fighting against, right? Helena, what do you make of I suppose we are now seeing some real difference between what Rishi Sunak is saying and what the Labour Party are saying. How significant do you see that as?
I think it's actually very significant that we've seen this division between the two party lines that have been mostly pretty lockstep up until this point, apart from whether or not you define it as a ceasefire, humanitarian pause. To this point, it only really seemed to be the actual main difference between the two parties' positions in terms of how they approach the international relations part of this particular conflict. It is quite interesting, especially with the guest previously talking about David Cameron in specific. The man who's obviously, in my opinion, has the record as being the worst prime minister of all time, now might be able to be rightly given the title of the worst foreign secretary of all time, given that he might indeed, as has been pointed out, now be party to and aiding and abetting people who have been potentially given warrants for their arrest for war crimes and crimes against humanity with the weapons that we continue to sell them. This is, again, despite the fact we've all heard the leaked audio now from head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, saying that she believes that they've been given legal advice telling them to stop these arms shipments, and that Israel has broken international law, and that the people who are responsible for this, specifically Gallant and Netanyahu, are the ones who we continually defend. And of course, the Conservative Party have completely cornered themselves on this issue. They have nowhere else to go. There's no road left. Because they've committed themselves. They've committed themselves very specifically to this position of continuing this level of complete impunity for what Israel will do and have been doing up until this point. So to U-turn and accept the ICC potentially wanting to issue warrants for the arrest of the people that they've been giving tacit support to would therefore also put the fingers back at them and therefore condemn them by proxy because of the diplomatic support they've given for this engagement in what we believe to be war crimes, which we may indeed have some kind of legal position being taken up by the ICC over this as well. Important that the threshold for what Karim Khan said about the evidence that they had was that they think it was the likelihood of prosecution was high. They expected a high bar, and they've provided a high bar in terms of evidence. Evidence clearly that has been avoided by our own government. It's very ironic when you look back, for example, at the SNP motion about collective punishment, which is one of the very, very specific crimes that is being levied at Netanyahu and Gallant up to this point, and such that the Scottish Greens have called for David Cameron specifically to resign. With regards to the Labour position, I think they've been helped a lot by the fact that a lot of our European neighbours have taken a similar position to the Labour Party on this one. So they can't be seen to be outside of a broader consensus of other Western nations. It's just different to the United States, specifically because they are outside of the Rome Statute, whereas the European neighbours are within the Rome Statute. So that is a point where Labour are able to at least try and recover a lot of lost ground since that fateful Keir Starmer interview that they've tried to backpedal on to try and win over the kind of pro-Gaza votes in the UK at the very least. Or indeed, it might just be a genuine ethical position that David Lammy takes. I used to have a lot of respect for him, so I'm glad that since a lot of my respect has waned, he's tried to claw some of that back by taking the position that I fully support the statements that he'd made in the House of Commons in the clip that you played. One last interesting point as well is that, of course, Labour are incredibly likely to be the new government. And the person who is most likely to take over from Netanyahu when potential elections happen once the Netanyahu government collapses is Benny Gantz. Now, Benny Gantz is somebody who did specifically say that the ICC's claims were absolutely nonsensical and that Netanyahu shouldn't be brought in front of the court. So it will be interesting to see what happens with international relations between Israel and its allies post-war, given essentially this gigantic diplomatic rift over whether or not the Prime Minister of Israel should indeed be hauled in front of the Criminal Court for war crimes.
Whenever the coming general election is called, Labour looks set to win a majority. But could they end up entering Parliament without their leader? Well, that's the hope of Andrew Feinstein, who has today announced he will be standing to be an MP in Keir Starmer's Holborn and St Pancras constituency. He is a former MP for the ANC in South Africa who's written extensively on the arms trade and international human rights. And Andrew Feinstein joins me now. First of all, what made you decide to stand against Keir Starmer?
You know, I've been thinking about it for a while. I've been consulting with a lot of people in the constituency where I live, which is Starmer's constituency. And a number of factors have come together. I think the hardships that many people face in the constituency to do with inadequate social housing, cutbacks to public transport, care and benefit systems that are just not working, obviously, and not just in this constituency, but the state of the NHS. Then, of course, probably the clinching factor for me has been Labour's position on Gaza and its complete abrogation of any support for the Palestinian people, for the international rule of law, for at least enforcing British law, let alone international law, on our arms exports. And I think that what these two things, which are very closely related, what these two things, the domestic and the international, really reflect is the state of our politics. And perhaps most emblematic of that at the moment is my own MP, Keir Starmer. And there are many people in the constituency who've encouraged me to stand. And over the past months, thinking about it, talking to people about it, I decided a few days ago that I was actually going to do it. And so announced that today.
With all due respect, I assume you don't think you'll actually sort of win the constituency against Keir Starmer. So, short of that, what are you hoping to achieve with this campaign? Is it to sort of get publicity or to sort of raise the visibility of sort of your critiques of Keir Starmer?
I always enter things to try and win them. But I'm also aware, having worked on the global arms trade for the past 23 years, that there's something called success without victory. So the other things that I think we're looking at is rebuilding progressive structures and momentum in the constituency, because I think people have felt quite disillusioned since 2019, bringing people together. But it also it's not just for me as an individual. This is going to be a very sort of people-centered, community-based campaign with a massive consultative process where everybody in the constituency will have an opportunity to input to the campaign manifesto. We're trying to show that politics can be done in a different way and inspire people to get involved politically. I think people are feeling almost impotent in the face of current politics. We have 76% of people in this country wanting a ceasefire in Gaza. And no senior politician in either of the major parties is committed to an unqualified ceasefire, which is extraordinary. And I think that distance between sort of the rulers and the ruled feels particularly profound at the moment. And I come from a political tradition in South Africa, obviously, hugely different from Britain, but a political tradition that is incredibly engaging with people on the ground. In our 1994 election, our great leaders like Mandela and Sisulu and Slovo and others, rather than just telling people what they would do for them, they embarked on a massive process of what we call people's forums, simply to listen to people. And I think that's one of the big problems in our politics. And we feel it particularly in this constituency, where since Keir Starmer has been our MP since 2015, people have felt that his instincts are authoritarian, even undemocratic. He feels very distant from the constituency and from the people of the constituency. And a lot of people are asking whether he represents his billionaire donors or the people he was actually elected by and who he was elected to represent. So I think just to try and show that there is a way out of this malaise, even if it's not victory in this constituency, but I wouldn't rule that out either.
We've got an interesting question in the comments from Dwayne Bowman. He says, Andrew, why not run with the Green Party? Did you sort of consider maybe running with the Greens? Why did you decide to sort of stand as an independent?
Yeah, well, it's not my place to go and, say to a party that I've never been a member of that I should be their candidate to stand. That's the first thing. There have been some overtures, and I'm meeting with some Green Party members over the next few days to talk about the campaign. I think it's quite important at this point for the movement of independence. I think there are going to be a lot of independents standing. I think, Leanne Mohammed against Wes Streeting is a great example. And a lot of us are talking to each other and working together. And to be honest with you, Michael, I haven't been a successful joiner. I'm not one to be constrained by party manifestos and policies. I like to, as I've done for the last 23 years, write what I like, say what I like, and what I think. I have a fairly unique personal and political history, and that, determines my perspective on all of the issues, economic issues. I have training as an economist. And there was no political party that I felt completely comfortable with. I'd been a member of Labour for a while, even, in the ANC, which I was enormously honored to be a part of when it was still a banned movement in South Africa. And until late 2001, when I never actually left the party, but I resigned from Parliament, I actually challenged my own party around a corrupt $10 billion arms deal, where we neither needed nor used the arms at huge socioeconomic opportunity cost. So I think that the sort of the approach of an independent stand against Starmer is one that suits me much better, and I think actually suits this political moment in some ways better.
We're going to move on from your candidacy because I want to sort of take advantage of having you here to get your reaction to a clip I want to play. Because Michael Gove has delivered a speech claiming that Jews are increasingly under threat in Britain, and he's blamed pro-Palestine marchers for this state of affairs.
We know now that it is genuinely dangerous for people to be openly, clearly, proudly Jewish near these marches. At a time when we're all encouraged to be our whole authentic selves, to celebrate our identity, to be out and proud. There is only one group told that they, and they alone, can only be tolerated on terms set by others: Jews. The organisers of the marches say that there are Jewish people on their demonstrations, but they are only safe if they deny what is dear to so many Jewish people: the safety of people in Israel. If they are to be accepted on these marches, then they must knuckle under, accept the calls to globalize the Intifada or to end the Zionist entity. They have to obey the rules laid down by others, those march organizers, who reserve the right to tell Jews both where they should live in the world and how they should live on our streets.
Andrew Feinstein, I want to get your comment on this. You're, of course, a Jewish man and a supporter of Palestinian rights. What did you make of that claim? Jews are only welcome on these marches if they commit to everything that all of the organisers want, and so therefore they're essentially anti-Semitic, is what he's saying.
I mean, thank goodness I don't live in this make-believe world that Michael Gove does. I'm very seldom rendered speechless, but I feel almost that at this point. I mean, I've never heard such nonsense in my life. If one looks at the speakers at any of these rallies, it is extraordinary, the diversity of opinion, of political opinion. And, if one looks at the Jewish bloc on these marches, and specifically at the Jewish speakers, I mean, just this last one, we're of such a diversity. We come, this notion that Michael Gove and others try to impose on us, that there is sort of this Jewish community that is largely of one view. And then there are a few little outriders who conform to some sort of strange figment of his imagination and a few others' imagination of these sort of Jews who renounce their Judaism. I mean, it's actually deeply offensive. And the reality is that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world in Israel who are unbelievably critical of the Israeli state. And that doesn't necessarily imply that they accept everything that the organizers of our march, I mean, if you look at the organizers, if you look at the PSC and Stop the War, if you look at the individuals concerned, amongst them, there are deeply nuanced political differences. And I think what we are seeing in reaction to what I believe as someone who's lectured at Auschwitz on genocide, what we are seeing as a consequence of what I believe is a genocide being committed in Gaza is that people from a very wide array of political opinion are uniting and mobilizing in their opposition to what Israel, with British, American, and Western European support and weapons, is doing to the Palestinian people. And to try and turn this into something akin to a comic book that Michael Gove seems to be doing is actually deeply offensive, not just to our intellects, but I think to people's political sensibilities. To think that all Jews who go on these marches are like-minded thinkers, to think of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews around the world and in Israel itself, all think the same on all political issues around this. And this is the only way that we as Jews are given the space to express our politics is actually deeply reductionist and deeply offensive, and is more than anything else a reflection of our sclerotic politics that are both corrupt morally and materially. And I think this quote from Michael Gove is a wonderful representation of that and actually reflects quite a lot of the reasons why I've decided to stand. Because hopefully, through a lot of independent candidates in the next election, we'll be able to have a slightly more adult, more nuanced political discourse than we've had for the last few years from both the Tories and Labour in this country. Because really, this is almost as infantile, as disingenuous as David Lammy's comments, because I heard your earlier discussion about Lammy seeming to slightly alter his position. Whether that's an altering of Labour's position, we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see what the leader of the Labour Party has to say about it. But, he can say something like this now, but a few days ago, he was talking at a Republican Party event in the United States of America, where he completely misrepresented and, according to Mandela's grandson, abused the words and legacy of Nelson Mandela, who I worked for, to try and defend his appalling position on the genocide that is being committed. And then you see this from Michael Gove and you think to yourself, how did our politics get to this remarkably mediocre, mendacious level? And my goodness, from here on in, it can only be up.
The government's political violence advisor, John Woodcock, also known as Lord Wolney, has published a review into political activism in Britain. Called Protecting Our Democracy from Coercion, the former Labour MP and now crossbench peer argues that the government hasn't been tough enough on left-wing protesters. In his sights are groups like Just Stop Oil, as well as Palestine Action, who regularly shut down arms factories that provide weapons and parts to Israel. On a recent episode of the News Agents podcast, Woodcock laid out his thinking about the group.
Palestine Action have been openly, they were live tweeting the occupation and damage that they were causing to a Leicester defence factory last week. So there is not close to being a level of deterrent inhibition.
So what are you saying? They're not allowed to be tweeting outside a defence factory, or what's happening?
Well,
to
no, they weren't just stood there tweeting outside of the defence factory. They were tweeting, "Come and join our." Essentially, criminal sabotage to smash this place up. So there is a level of network of organisation and ability to fundraise, which I think you could inhibit through some kind of prohibition restriction order. Now, the detail of that would have to be carefully calibrated. And no one is saying, I'm certainly not saying that it should equate to terrorism legislation. I would imagine the tariffs for terrorist offences would rightly remain significantly higher.
I mean, come on, you would hope,
sure,
right? But you would hope that we're locking up terrorists, not people who are protesting against climate change. Wouldn't you? No, I mean, okay.
Well, but we're talking about Palestine Action. I mean, the damage that they are doing to defence sites, the way that they are. You could use the word terrorising workers.
So they are terrorists in your head?
No, I'm not saying that, but there is a level of criminal damage and disruption that we should not be relaxed about.
Emily Maitlis very explicitly gave him the chance to sort of distance himself from the idea that people who, commit criminal damage, I mean, he calls it defence sites. These are arms factories, right? Saying, well, they are terrorising workers. I mean, terrorism is about killing people to achieve a political aim, right? None of the direct action groups he is talking about have committed any violence against people, right? To sort of consider criminal damage on a par with terrorism, I think just completely misunderstands the significance of human life, right? The reason why we think of, I agree, terrorism is very bad, right? The reason we think of terrorism as so worrying, right, is because you're trying to achieve a political aim, a political end by indiscriminate murder. Now, throwing some red paint or shutting down a factory, I mean, it's not indiscriminate for a start because, they're going for the factory, and it's not violence against a person, right? It's criminal damage. And Woodcock's main idea, though, is that the risk of criminal prosecution doesn't go far enough to deter this kind of activism. Instead, the government should be introducing laws that come close to terrorism legislation to clamp down on people, not necessarily for actual crimes, but for hypothetical ones.
Well, it's only about climate change. We all agree with tackling climate change, and so let's not bother. I mean, if you'd got to the Magna Carta, the activists had got to the Magna Carta last week and managed to damage it in the name of, I think, climate change. We'll be saying, but it's climate
two women
change.
in their 80s.
Oh, it wouldn't not necessarily,
So you've got sort of Hamas in one cell and the two ladies in their 80s in the other.
Well, I mean, if we could do more to lock Hamas up, that would be also a good thing. But it's not okay to commit criminal damage.
That was a reference to this Just Stop Oil protest in early May. So two women in their 80s, one of them an Anglican priest, lightly cracked the tempered glass of the case housing the Magna Carta in the British Library before gluing themselves to the frame. The library described the damage to the case as minimal and said the Magna Carta was not damaged, and there's no indication there was any intention to harm the historical document. So in the interview, Woodcock saying, well, what if they damaged the Magna Carta? Well, I think it's probably pretty clear they wouldn't have done that. These are sort of 80-year-old Anglican priests. I would imagine that going there and sort of smashing the glass was what they were intending to do, right? And you can't charge them for something they might have done, but probably wouldn't have. Both women were charged with criminal damage, so that's the crime they committed. But for Woodcock, that's not good enough. In his report, Woodcock has 40 recommendations for dealing with what he calls extreme protest movements. And among his most draconian ideas is that police should be allowed to extend anti-terrorism covert surveillance techniques, including phone taps, to activist groups. Another recommendation is that the government should introduce extra consequences for groups that engage in civil disobedience. That's beyond criminal charges for individuals breaking the law. He wants the government to be able to block entire activist groups from organising and fundraising. So that's a technique some people are calling prescription light, right? So if you can't raise any money, that's a lot like being a prescribed group. What Woodcock is suggesting is a radical break with a long British tradition of political freedom, and his report is at risk of being taken seriously, and that's because he's the government's independent advisor. But just how independent is he? Well, he seems to have had Palestine action in his sights for a while, saying this on October the 15th last year. Investigation by Kate Ferguson showing how pro-Palestinian extremists targeting defence companies in the UK with criminal damage that could put workers' lives at risk. Britain will not be intimidated by Hamas's little helpers. Now, this is someone putting himself forward as an independent advisor, I think, on political extremism, saying it's calling people protesting a genocidal war in Gaza Hamas's little helpers. Woodcock has never been a fan of the left either. Before becoming the government's political violence advisor, Woodcock was a Labour MP, but he quit the party in 2018, saying Labour had been taken over by the hard left. He meant Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, of course. Woodcock's relation to Israel and to the arms industry also casts his independence into doubt. From 2011 to 2013, he was chair of Labour Friends of Israel, and he's now the paid chair of the Purpose Coalition, whose members include international arms manufacturer Leonardo. Now, the NGO Action on Armed Violence says this about that firm. Leonardo UK, a branch of Italy's leading defence manufacturer, expanded its influence in the defence sector when its American counterpart, Leonardo DRS, merged with the Israeli radar firm Radar in November 2022. Radar's radar systems notably provide comprehensive coverage across the Gaza Strip. Furthermore, Leonardo equips Israel with Ayamaki M346 aircraft and parts for Apache attack helicopters. The company's site in Edinburgh is responsible for producing the laser targeting system used in F-35 fighter jets. So this is a guy who's put himself forward, who claims to be this independent advisor, who's saying we need to treat people who sort of blockade arms manufacturers as the same as terrorists. Meanwhile, he is the paid sort of head or a paid lobbyist for this firm or this organization that includes firms that are literally supplying Israel with weapons. That, to me, sounds like there's some conflicts of interest. Now, those charges were put to Woodcock by the newsagents.
You are the former chair of Labour Friends of Israel. Do you not see that, how this is going to come across to supporters of Palestinian liberation?
Well, I mean, I don't think I would go into this thinking I was going to make friends with people who were part of that extreme end of the pro-Palestine movement anyway. But I think the public and lawmakers are going to have to look at this report in the round. It's a big report. It's 100,000 words. It's got a lot of. It's got a lot of.
Talk us through this. What is the Defence Purpose Coalition? We've been honestly scratching our heads and calling around trying to work out what the Defence Purpose Coalition is or does. You're the current chair of that as well.
The Purpose Coalition is an organisation of purpose-led groups, including has been some defence-related companies who value the contribution that they make to the UK economy, and we should all do that.
But the point you make about that, look, you know, you are an impartial voice on this. I just think that the perception would be that people would beg to differ, given, you know, you kind of have a role with the defence industry. You have been a part of Labour Friends of Israel. I just think it's worth addressing.
Look, everyone comes to particular roles with a particular background, of course. And, you know, my background on this has been very clear. I was a Labour MP. I left the Labour Party during the Jeremy Corbyn era. And so all of that is set out as a matter of public record.
His background, right? Chairing the Purpose Coalition is not his background, right? This coalition that includes arms firms which are selling arms to Israel. That's not his background. That's a job he's still doing. It's a paid job he's still doing. Helena, this is ridiculous, right? This is ridiculous. I'm not sure how much I rate those two hosts of the news agents. I quite like Lewis Goodall, but sometimes they sort of strike me as a little bit liberal and complacent. But they kind of skewered him there, and his answers were appalling. And this whole situation just, to me, seems like an absolute joke.
Oh, 100%. I mean, a joke is an unfortunate term to me, because I think it's so dangerous. It's so dangerous, really and truly, that this man can have so much power. I did enjoy, to be fair, though, John Sopel saying, oh, well, some people might beg to differ, as a very nice way of saying that's a bunch of bollocks, isn't it? Because it was a bunch of bollocks, let's be real, everything that Mr. Woodcock there was saying. And it is interesting just how, like, LFI seem to just turn up when they're not wanted so often in these instances, especially when, like, this concept of an independent advisor is basically being entirely, completely made redundant under the Conservative government as it is. Like, none of their independent advisors have ever been independent. Remember their independent pay review boards that were just people who were appointed by the Conservative government anyway, so they all agreed with what they were saying regardless. Like, none of these people are independent. And obviously this discussion about, oh, well, it's a matter of public record, is one of the biggest failures, I think, of the way in which we deal with conflicts of interest in our democracy, in that you just declare that you have one and then we just forget about it, especially when, on a democratic level, people make their democratic decisions based upon what the perceived conflicts of interests are. But you can't do that with an appointed position like an independent quote-unquote advisor. And he even calls the report, right? There's how much of a joke this is. He even calls the report about protecting democracy. No, you are undermining democracy, John. You are undermining the very basic principle of freedom of assembly that liberal democracy is supposed to protect, whilst doing it as a position of a paid lobbyist for the arms industry who are explicitly trying to protect with a bunch of these recommendations that you've put forward here. So to say you're protecting democracy by doing the complete opposite in an undemocratically appointed position is just kind of, it's ridiculous to the point of obscenity at this point, really and truly. And there's so many dangerous things and dangerous recommendations. I thought we'd look through a couple of them here. So this recommendation that they should try and have more surveillance of these particular protest groups, it reminds me a lot of the Spy Cops scandal that seemed to have never actually come to any kind of conclusion that was satisfactory. And also, we might end up having a rerun of this. People who don't know in chat who are watching this video potentially, is that there were people from our security services who were undercover getting into relationships with people from left-wing political movements, having families with them, and then disappearing without a trace because they were there to gather information, creating entire fake identities. And so all of this extra surveillance on people who haven't committed crimes yet, but they perceive that they might commit crimes in the future as justification for this kind of the surveillance. It's really kind of dystopian. Another dangerous part of these recommendations is how nebulous a lot of the terminology is. So things like serious disruption is very much open to interpretation. So is indeed the term economic damage, in terms of not just the idea of making protest movements pay for their own policing, but also on top of that, trying to get them to have to compensate businesses for economic damage that they might theoretically incur because they might have a drop in footfall because a certain amount of London, I guess, might be out of action due to a high turnout on a protest movement. And again, what is or is not economic damage is entirely up for interpretation, is not exactly quantitative. And another one there is something that might result in intimidation. And again, that is entirely up for a certain level of subjectivity, especially when there are contentious terms like the chant "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which I think most people would understand to be a call for liberation for people in that geographical area, especially the Palestinians, who are the ones who do not have the freedom, whereas people who are members of the State of Israel do. Except you say, well, that might result in intimidation because there are a small subset of people who feel intimidated by it, and therefore that can then take away the free speech rights. I guess we have free speech rights, we have the freedom of assembly rights of people who should have a legitimate right to protest in liberal democracy, which is going to go away or potentially be dramatically curtailed by recommendations that are being put forward here. I wonder if Toby Young from the Free Speech Union is going to have any comments on these. I think not. And other things as well was that there is the potential that they might want to get rid of jury trials for these kind of things, because one of the recommendations is that, well, juries might be biased on issues such as climate change and foreign policy. So even the basics of our legal system of having a jury of your peers be there to judge whether or not you've been made guilty of a crime or not might also be curtailed potentially under these recommendations. Some very draconian, some very, very anti-democratic actions being done in the name of democracy. You couldn't make it up.
Yeah, I think it's a really important safety valve, with these cases, because the thing that really angered them was with the Colston statue. And the reason they got off is, essentially because the jury sort of decided, well, this statue shouldn't really have been there anyway, right? But that's not, obviously activists on Twitter shouldn't really be able to decide that. But if you've got a randomly selected group of citizens and they decide that, great. That seems like a really sort of important part of the justice system, right? You can have a jury that makes some exceptions if they think there's sort of overwhelming evidence in one direction or another. Now, obviously, that shouldn't be based on prejudice. It shouldn't sort of, if you're sort of finding someone guilty for some prejudice reason, then obviously that'd be a big problem. But if you're saying, well, we think an injustice was done and that throwing it in the river wasn't the end of the world, I kind of think that's a cool part of the legal system that obviously, it's no wonder that these people want to get rid of. Helena, I loved your comment. We've got this problem where we think transparency is declaring your interests and then forgetting about them. I think that's very well put when it comes to the state of British politics. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Lots of nuggets of wisdom as ever.
Absolutely. I really appreciate bringing me on. It's been an excellent show today. I really enjoyed Andrew Feinstein's contributions today. Everyone should go out, support your independence, support Andrew, support Leanne as well. They're doing excellent work, and I wish them both the best in the coming election.
And thank you everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.